Thank you very much for this undeserved applause. Um, uh, Dear distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, a very warm good evening from my side. I have to confess that I feel deeply inadequate in handling this session with the conclusions. And not only because you have discussed very important topics, technology, energy, renewable energies, domotics, you name it, and you've had the most distinguished speakers on the topic. But I also feel deeply inadequate because I haven't been here. I just came back this morning from Shanghai after a trip to Tokyo on occasion of the IMF. And so I frankly have to confess that I remember when I was a young student, there was this dean of my university who always chaired all panels. And during the panels, he would visibly go to sleep. And people were actually scared that he might fall off the chair. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the panel discussion, he would wake up and draw the conclusions. And I have to tell you that his remarks were really fascinating. And the first time I was astonished, the second time as well. From the third time on, I realized that he was always saying the same general things that could more or less apply to any situation. Well, he was a bit older than I am, and I don't have the same experience, and I don't have the same ability and the same intelligence. So I'm painfully aware of my inadequacy under the circumstances, and I think I will just share with you some of the thoughts, some of the messages that come out of the IMF meeting in Tokyo. I would say that two key readings of the various sessions, one negative and one positive. The negative reading is that the IMF has confirmed what we all were becoming aware of, that is that the global economy is slowing down. On the other side, there was a positive reading. There was not so explicit, was not that well articulated to the outside, but in the inner circles, behind closed doors, it was very strong. And that is that the darkest cloud on the world economy, that is the Eurozone, the risk of implosion of the Euro and of the breakup of the Eurozone, these clouds actually have cleared up. And now there is, I would say, a robust belief that the Euro is here to stay and the Eurozone will continue. So along these lines, let me share with you what is my reading of the most recent developments in the world economy with a special focus on the Eurozone and the Euro periphery. Up until July, the global investors tended to see the world in black and white. What was white and what was black. White was Germany, white was China, white was Asia, and perhaps some slivers of America. And all the rest was black, and in particular the Eurozone and the Euro periphery. After June, it has become clear that the world economy was actually slowing down. But at the same time, the stock market after July, stock markets started to pick up. And in fact, if you take the financials of the Euro periphery appreciated by 40%. So there is an apparent inconsistency between the world economy slowing down and the stock market appreciating. How do you explain this inconsistency? I see three major discontinuities since July. The first one coincides with the speech by Mario Draghi, the chairman of the European Central Bank, in London at the opening of the Olympic Games. Actually, it was not a speech at the Olympic Games, but it happened simultaneously. And short sentence of his marked this discontinuity when he said, we will do what it takes to save the euro. This commitment was actually backed up by, sorry, I have to turn off my mobile, was actually backed up by all European leaders that explicitly stated that they were committing to morph the Eurozone, to the progress of the Eurozone, to the convergence of the Eurozone into a more integrated set of countries. At the same time, and this is the second discontinuity, the Eurosceptics, which are many, there were quite a few of them, particularly in London, in the US, and so on. And you could count the numerous gurus among the economists, university professors, and the community of the financial analysts. All these negative gurus who were predicting the breakup of the Eurozone and the implosion of the euro actually started to say that at this stage we cannot go back. It is too costly and too risky to experience the breakup of the euro and of the Eurozone. And therefore, there's only one way to go. The only way to go is to go forward. The third element of discontinuity is that the global investors started to appreciate that more or less all key regions in the world, all key countries had major problems or significant problems, starting from China, where the growth is slowing down, has been slowing down significantly. India. In India, growth has been slowing down as well, and there are political issues as well. Special places like Australia that seem to be immune from any negative development in the economy, of course, suffered from the developments in China and India. Brazil as well. I mean, the growth in Brazil starting to flatten out. And the US, of course, people started to become aware of something that was known since a long time, that is the fiscal cliff. The fiscal cliff is getting closer and closer, and yes, there is, everyone hopes that the Americans will be able to deal with it as they should, but for the time being, there is no clear solution in sight. The global investors all of a sudden stopped to see the world in black and white. And we might say that we went from a world of black and white to a world with 50 shades of gray. Or if you want to be more politically correct without any reference and misinterpretation, that of course is not intended, 1,000 shades of gray. Now, what is actually behind the thinking of the global investors? What do they actually see? Well, let me share with you my reading. First of all, on the Eurozone and the Euro periphery. First of all, the Eurozone includes 332 million people. And the Eurozone, if it were one country, it would have the largest GDP in the world, higher than the American GDP. That is, the Eurozone altogether is the largest market in the world, and you simply cannot ignore the largest market in the world. Second, I think that there are significant misconceptions about the Eurozone, about the macroeconomic reality of the Eurozone and its member countries. When people were fearing, and the one that were forecasting the breakup of the Euro and the Eurozone, they always refer to one indicator, sovereign debt, which in itself is a highly simplistic view. But is it really so? Well, if you compare the the sovereign debt of the Eurozone to that of America and Japan, you're in for some surprises. In the US, if you calculate the debt to GDP according to the same criteria adopted when you calculate for any other countries, according to the estimates of prominent American economists, the American debt is, thank you, grazie mille. The US sovereign debt would be above 120%. Japan is at 220%. The average for the Eurozone is between 87 and 92%. Thank you very much. And for Italy, it is above 120. But if you go a little bit beyond sovereign debt, and you look, for instance, at total debt, that is debt including private debt, corporate debt, and household debt, well, then you start seeing a completely different reality. In the US, the total debt to GDP is 360%. For Japan, it is above 400%. For the Eurozone, we are down to 232%. And for Italy, we are exactly on the European average, 232%. That is, the American debt to GDP is 130 percentage points higher than the Italian total debt. Then, of course, there is debt, but you also have to consider wealth, the ratio of wealth to GDP. And, well, the Eurozone is way better off than the US and Japan. In the US, the total wealth of the country is 4 times GDP. In Japan, it is 4 times 0.4. In Europe, 5 times. In Italy, 5.6 times. That is significantly higher in proportion than in the US. If you look at the budget deficit, and I take the last figures from The Economist, the budget deficit in the US is 7.6%. The European average is 3.5. And, well, surprise, surprise, Italy is below the European average. It is only 2.8%. Now, Italy, the budget deficit of Italy is 1/3 of the US budget deficit, percentage-wise. Not only that, Italy enjoys a primary surplus, and within the Western world, Italy and Germany are the only countries with a primary surplus. And if you look at the balance of trade, we could draw similar conclusions. So, to sum it up, when people say that the Eurozone is in trouble, that Italy, that the Euro periphery is in trouble, again, unfortunately, this reflects what we read in the media rather than what we can read in the numbers. One more remark on the Eurozone. The Eurozone is not only the largest market in the world. It is in the Eurozone we have major brands and major industrial companies that are integrated in the global economy, because nowadays any company, regardless of the size, even some small, medium-sized companies, have optimized their value chain on a global scale. And so, if there is a crisis in the Eurozone, that is not a crisis of the Eurozone. That is a crisis with global repercussions. I was in China recently, and I have some Chinese friends here in the room that can confirm it. I mean, the Chinese manufacturing sector immediately feels the slowing down of the Eurozone economy, because such is the integration among the various economies. If there are vast misconceptions about the Eurozone altogether, the misconceptions are even larger when we talk about the Euro periphery. Because outside of Europe, people tend to put the Euro periphery, and by Euro periphery I basically talking about so-called pigs or jeeps or whatever you want to call them, that is Portugal, Spain, Greece, and Italy. It's as if they put them in a blender, okay, and they assume that what comes out of the blender, that is, applies to everyone. Well, it is not so. There are profound differences among the various countries. If you look at the industrial consistency of these countries, for instance, well, take Greece. In Greece, there is only one industry, okay, that is tourism. Take Spain. There is only one industry, that is real estate. That happens to be the industry that basically went bankrupt and pulled down the entire economy. Take Italy. Well, Italy has an industrial texture that is very similar to the German industrial texture. In fact, in Europe, the industrial belt runs from Hamburg to Florence. And no other country in Europe has, besides Germany, has such a well-diversified industrial base. Italy is not only about fashion, it's not only about luxury goods, shoes and stuff like that. There is a mechanical industry, pharmaceutical industry, advanced industries that are just, if not more important, and that are doing extremely well. In fact, our bank, and I don't know if my colleagues have already illustrated this this morning. You have, Gregorio, yes, so I will not repeat what he has said much better than I have. But just the key message, the Italian companies that export, that are export-driven, are actually growing at least as much as the German companies, if not more. Then you look at the banking system. Again, the banking system is in completely different situations that vary from country to country. In Greece, I mean, well, basically the banking system is bankrupt. In Spain, the banking system has severe problems. Number one, the Spanish banks are exposed to the bankrupt industry, that is the real estate industry. And second, the local banks, the caixas, well, they're all small, mismanaged, and suffer from major political interferences. The Italian banking system is not exposed to one disaster industry such as real estate. In fact, in Italy, we don't have the risk of a real estate bubble at all. In Italy, real estate is owned by people own their house. And there is no such risk. We are not seeing major volatility in prices, great stability, and there is no exposure to any single industry. Also, the business model of Italian banks is far more conservative, leverage is much lower, so that in the end, even in this respect, we are much better off. I would say that also if you look at unemployment figures, unemployment in Italy is high, but is below the European average. And finally, when it comes to management of public finances, I think that in Italy, I mean, the Italian government is doing a pretty good job. In fact, I have to say that what the Italian government has managed to do in less than 11 months is actually quite remarkable in terms of the implementation of what is normally called fiscal package or austerity package, but I think we should call it more properly a responsibility package, because in the end, even with public finances, the same rules that apply to family finances or corporate finances should apply. If they're out of order, you have to bring them back in order. Italian government has pushed through some significant reforms. I think very successfully a pension reform that gives us the best balanced pension system within the Eurozone. There are no unfunded pension liabilities in the Italian system. We pushed through some liberalization and so on. The job is not finished, but we have already done a lot. Now, what do the member countries have to do, in particular the countries from the Eurozone, and what should Europe do at a global level, I mean at an integrated level? Well, at country level, governments have to continue to push through structural reforms. In Europe, there is significant room for improvement. And second, I think that there is room for privatizing large sector of the public economy. Probably not at the national level, but at local level. Because the services provided by the public companies held at local level overall are not that competitive. In the end, they cost more to the taxpayer, and there are some examples that unfortunately are in the media every day, examples where the public sector at local level actually harbors all sorts of corruption. It's not the general rule, but it happens, and I think that here we could draw some resources that would actually allow us to reduce the total debt, total sovereign debt, and to reduce the burden to the taxpayer. But there are also interventions that should be done at the macro level, I mean at the European level. I think that these programs to intervene to support local debt via the ESM, OMT, and so on, however you want to call it, every day someone invents new acronyms, are very important, and I think are very, very useful. And personally, I'm very much in favor of conditionality attached to these interventions. And to be explicit again, I think that Spain should apply for bailout help. Second, I think that in Europe we have to be more realistic with cross-border transfer of funds. That is, Greece will not be able to make it on its own, but if you look in the US, the cross-border transfer of funds are 23 times higher than in Europe, and nobody thinks of expelling Alabama from the US, even though Alabama has a higher debt than Greece. We should also encourage labor mobility across states in Europe much more than we do. In the US, again, labor mobility is 15 times higher than in Europe. In Europe, of course, we have the problem language barriers, but perhaps we should encourage all member states to adopt English as a second mandatory language. Finally, Europe has to evolve towards a more integrated Europe, which means integrating Europe via four pillars. Banking union, which some form of which has just been approved, fiscal union, economic union, and political union. Altogether, I think that it is inevitable, unavoidable, that member states will surrender some local sovereignty in favor of shared sovereignty at the European level. In Europe, I think we start to have more clarity than ever on where we want to go and on what needs to be done. On where we want to go, I think that there is 90%, I would say as a personal assessment, 90% agreement. On what needs to be done, we're probably around 70%. Now, significant issues still remain on the how and the timeline, which are issues related to execution. And we have to bear in mind that, of course, there are great technical complexities associated with this process. And, of course, there is an issue also of political will. Now, to sum it up and come to the conclusions, I think I am personally quite positive about the future of the Eurozone. With the short term, we will continue to have significant challenges, but medium, long term, there is no reason why Europe shouldn't be a great success story, just as it has been in the past. I am equally positive on Italy, a country of great resources, great talent, great entrepreneurship, great creativity, great brands, and great attractions for the rest of the world. And finally, I am extremely positive about Russian and Italian relationships. I think we have countries which share friendship. There is great friendship between the two countries. There is great cultural affinity. Friendship and cultural affinity translate in good feelings, good vibes that you can sense when Russians come here and when Italians go to Russia. It's very palpable, very visible, very, very tangible. And I think that there is also a perfect economic strategic fit to the extent that Russia has great natural resources. The human capital is fantastic. I mean, the research and development, the universities and so on are a huge asset for Russia. In Italy, we have great companies, great brands. I think that there is a lot to be gained by mutually integrating further our economies. And finally, if you allow me to say a couple words about Intesa, and I know you have had too many speakers from Intesa, but I mean, I shall abuse from my position here, and I flicked upon you a few comments. I think that Intesa is a good and natural bridge between the two countries. Our business is not that of doing just banking or transactions. We are in the business of connecting entrepreneurs, of connecting ideas, of connecting capital, of connecting opportunities. And equally, being in this position, we are in the position to intercept trade flows, financial flows, capital flows, and the flows of idea, again, because everything starts with an idea. We are well suited to do this job. We are the #1 bank in Italy. I mean, we're #1 in retail banking, #1 in corporate and investment banking, and being #1 in corporate and investment banking means there's not one single significant Italian company that is not a client of ours. And last but not least, we are also #1 in asset management and wealth management. And again, I mean, there's a lot of wealth in our countries that is seeking good opportunities for investment. Our capital position is extremely strong, not only among Italian banks, but among the large European banks. We are one of the most liquid European banks, if not the most liquid. We are a very efficient bank as well, but I think that our greatest asset cannot be captured by the numbers. Our greatest assets are people. It's the people of Intesa that we can really create good opportunities for Russia, for Italy, good opportunities for all of you and all of your friends and colleagues. And frankly, when I think about the human capital of Intesa, I cannot think of anyone better than Professor Falico. That if I were not sitting next to the Russian ambassador, I would say that he is an excellent ambassador of Italy to the business community of Russia. Finally, and this is my closing remark, we are today in a city with a symbol of city of Romeo and Juliet, is a symbol of love, symbol of romance. I think that today this is also the city of love between two people, Russian people and Italian people. And it's not only a city of romance and love between people, it's also a city that loves business and that signifies the love for the business between Russians and Italians. Thank you very much for your attention.